Hey everybody, welcome to Outpost Gray, a YouTube channel designed to provide you education in cybersecurity, technology, and innovation. I'm your host, Jax Scott, and today we are here to chat with industry experts in a space that I like to call sizzling hot. It is the GRC space. But before we hop in, quick admin things really quickly. As you guys know, and if you're new here, every Thursday we drop a new episode. Typically, the episodes are live streams between 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Next week on Thursday, we are going outside of our regular hour, and we are going to be going live from 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am actually really excited because I'm going to be talking to the founder of InfoSec Live, Simon Lindstedt. If you don't know about his community, you definitely need to check it out. Simon has done something extremely remarkable. He has created a cybersecurity community from scratch. So during this episode, he and I are going to discuss how he created the community and the vision and the mission of InfoSec Live. So definitely stay tuned for that. Also, this actual next weekend, not this weekend, but the following weekend, I'll probably be putting some marketing material out next week around this, but I'm doing something a little crazy and wild. It is called the 4x4x48. And so what it is, oh my gosh, what it is every 4 hours, I run 4 miles for 48 hours. So it'll be a total of 48 miles. I won't be sleeping. It'll start on Friday. I think it's at 1 or 2 in the afternoon. We start the race and we end it on Sunday around 10, 11 in the morning. Now, the purpose of this is to raise money and awareness around veterans and veterans' mental health and TBIs and PTSD. And specifically, the money is getting raised for the Special Operations Association of America, but even more so for the Warrior Angel Foundation, which is focused on helping veterans cure themselves. Because even though sometimes we come back from war and we look unscathed, internally, we still have some issues. So stay tuned for that. I will be going live the weekend after next, so you don't want to miss that. And then lastly, before we jump in, if you haven't done so already, make sure that you hit the subscribe button down below. And then as you're listening to this, if this really inspires you, and even if it doesn't, go ahead and hit that like button and make sure to share this episode out with others. All right, so GRC, right? What is GRC? All these acronyms. Well, GRC is a combined approach towards governance, risk, and compliance aided by information technology. So what does that mean? Really high level, it's a critical component of cybersecurity that has become increasingly more visible in the past few years. Some of the shifts that have been causing GRC to come to the forefront is because of the changing business dynamics that we're seeing, and then even more so, the rapid emerging technology that we're seeing coming to the market. So throughout this discussion, throughout this panel, you are going to learn about cybersecurity, risk management frameworks, their purposes, why GRC is at the forefront of conversation, and how to create and foster champions to support GRC within the C-suite. But before I pull the panelists on, I want to remind you, I will be fielding questions throughout this panel. We have some amazing key leaders on this panel, so you don't want to miss the opportunity to ask them a question. So make sure to drop your questions in the chat using a capital Q so I can see them quickly, and I can definitely get to them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring these panelists on the stage. Woo! That motivates me every single time that does that. I love that. How are you guys? Welcome, Gerald, Jacob, Erika, Linda. How are you guys doing?
Excellent.
Awesome. That discussion was that's way different on this side. I've only ever seen them watching, but when you actually get portaled through the transition, that's an experience.
I love this. You guys, this is going to be so awesome. I've planned this panel. Oh God, when did I reach out to you guys? Probably well over a month. It's been in works for about 2 months. So I know I'm super excited about it. I'm so grateful for each of you guys making the time. I know that my viewers are tired of hearing me talk. So what I'd like to do is let's kick it off going around the horn, and each of you just spend a couple of minutes sharing a little bit about your background and why you're here on the panel. And Jacob, I'm going to pass it over to you first.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Jacob Horne. I'm the Chief Security Evangelist at a company called Summit 7, and we specialize in working services and compliance and security for contractors in the defense industrial base, which people may have, have come across in the news with all of these new regulations that are being foisted on government contractors around the protection of controlled information, new requirements, new assessment regimes, and things like that. I've been working in cybersecurity for about 15 years now. First 8 of those, I was on active duty in the Navy, where I got to do a lot of cool stuff, from some cool SIGINT operation stuff all the way over to blue team operations. Kind of ran the spectrum, and then I ended up strangely working in the federal acquisition space when I got out of the Navy. And since then, I've sort of followed that thread through various positions, which has sort of firmly planted me into the world of GRC as the world of regulations has started to merge with security and privacy, causing that field to now be very important and misunderstood, which is, I think, something that we're going to talk about today.
I love that. Great job. I love that intro, Jacob. All right, Gerald, I'm passing it over to you.
Oh, hey, thanks a lot, Jax. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're tuning in, everybody. My name is Gerald Auger. I've added a fire emoji to my name because this is going to be a sizzling hot talk, y'all. So a little brief intro on me. I have worked in the InfoSec space for about 17 years, academically trained in computer science, so I have that technical background, but I really did come up and make my bones, if you will, on the GRC side, starting with audit. I was at Booz Allen for several years doing FISMA work, moved into risk after that, and now I'm an information security officer at a mid-sized organization, and I'm rolling out, or I've rolled out NIST cybersecurity framework. So big advocate of the whole NIST space. I feel like if you're passionate about NIST, you're like almost gush about it. If you're passionate about SOC 2, you gush about it. I'm firmly in the NIST camp. But totally excited to discuss with this amazing panel. Frankly, it's quite impressive what you've put together, Jack. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Gerald. I appreciate it. And speaking of SOC 2, I'm going to pull Erika up here because I know that SOC 2 is her jam. So go for it, Erika.
Thanks, Jax. And super thrilled to be here, guys. So my name is Erika McDuffie. I have been in this space for a little shy of 10 years, which is crazy to think about. I came up a very traditional route, majored in cybersecurity and information systems management. This has been my bread and butter. I started in through the application security side of the house, pen testing, then transitioned into the vendor security management space. From there is when I really realized my passion for compliance, governance, and security, and marrying all of those together, and the need that organizations had for leveling up their game in that aspect. A few jobs later, I found where I am today, and I'm working for a large cybersecurity consulting firm. I have been really specialized in SOC 2, as you mentioned, Jax, but I have touched a wide array of frameworks around audit, also consulting and providing assurance needs for customers of all sorts of different sizes. So I'm super excited to be talking and diving into this subject matter a little bit further.
I love it. Thank you, Erika. And then Linda.
Well, so I'm the principal and founder of SecureThink Corporation. I have been in cybersecurity for just about 10 years, the last 5 of which has been focused on communicating the cybersecurity business case to the C-suite and boards of directors. I'm a senior advisor to CISOs in that space. My career in cyber started with a computer engineering degree, and that's about the only reasonably conventional thing about how I journeyed to this space. The first part of my career culminated in me running some very large mission-critical technology projects in very large enterprises, Fortune 500 kinds of organizations. And what I found was that the really biggest problems I encountered weren't the technology. It was that the business was very upset that we were changing the business and nobody had their eye on that ball. You know, the technology had center stage, and yet we were forcing the business to change. And the business leaders correctly perceived that they were getting shoved around. So having encountered a lot of problems in that space, I long ago got myself skills to understand how to engage the business and minimize those kinds of problems. And once upon a time, 10 years ago, I landed in a technology project, which happened where the nature of the technology happened to be cyber. And so I've been in cyber ever since, and I have been engaging stakeholders ever since. So the governance, the risk, and the compliance here, governance by its very nature means that we are working with senior leaders. And so that's clearly managing risk is one of their missions. It's core to their mission. I got interested in compliance more recently. Really, it's been my pandemic project to dig deeper into specifically CMMC, which is happening in the defense space, mostly because I noticed that a lot of companies needed to kind of have the threat of third-party assessment hanging over them to get serious about doing cybersecurity. So that's me. Happy to be here. This is a heck of a dream.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. I love origin stories, and it's, as you all can see, very diverse backgrounds. So we're going to have a very diverse discussion. But to kick us off, Erika, you even mentioned it. You have good knowledge of the wide range of frameworks that are out there. And I know there's some confusion because you have SOC 2 and you've got ISO and you've got NIST. Can you provide us like a high level overview of these frameworks and what their intents are used for?
Yeah, so I will kick this off with, there is not a one word solution I can give you for which framework should I be using, right? I think that it is always an it depends type answer. Frameworks are designed to give structure, to provide a framework, and to give you some sort of roadmap to mature your organization from a security and compliance perspective. So let's just kick off with talking about some of the hot ones. So you hear about HIPAA. We hear about this from a healthcare side. Healthcare compliance, what is that, right? You have to be HIPAA compliant. However, HIPAA is not certifiable. So then that brings in HITRUST. HITRUST is a framework you can certify against for healthcare organizations touching healthcare data. From there, PCI. PCI is a standard that was developed to protect payment card data environment. And that is focused on payment processors. So if you're touching credit card data, processing that, PCI comes into scope for you. And that is something that a lot of organizations need. And all of these different frameworks have specifics that are tailored to, the business that they play in, and have, very stringent requirements on what it takes to both be assessed and who can assess you. Moving on to NIST, right? This is more prevalent. Well, I'm getting tongue twisted on the government sector. So NIST is a framework that was designed to provide some more structure, some more controls around that. FedRAMP is based on NIST, and FedRAMP, hey, if you're in the government space, you likely are going to go through a FedRAMP assessment. SOC 2 is a little bit more customizable. You see anywhere from mortgage lender applications to large share file type applications, to repositories, to even, let's just say, some of the day-to-day apps that you guys use. Those are household names that are using SOC 2. SOC 2 is one of the most customizable frameworks, and that is why, to me, it is so exciting. ISO, if you're doing international work, that is a quality standard. And ISO is really neat in the sense that it has different certifications that you can get under the governing body of ISO, the standards. And so if you're doing privacy, you may look into doing 27701. If you're worried about, the information management system, you might look into 27001. There's also ones about quality management system, business continuity. So there is a standard for everything. And so not to get too deep into it, I will just say that it is not a one size fits all. Some of our largest customers actually play in multiple of these certifications. And so finding coordination, harmony, and then also efficiencies across them is a beautiful thing. But Jax, I don't know that there is a clear solution for, hey, what does this look like in the future? Are we going to have some kind of commonality or one framework that fits all? I don't know. So I want to open it up to the other panelists here and see what their perspective is on some of these, what your experience has been working in on them, and what you guys think of the future.
Well,
yeah, please, Jacob. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, just to jump onto the point that you made about how, are we going to experience some sort of future GRC utopia where all of the frameworks are going to blend together into a single universal framework? And the answer to that is probably not, which is why GRC is such a compelling field, because there are all these facets, and for every industry, they seem to try to reinvent the wheel. But as other people would probably agree, under the hood, these controls are all eerily similar, and they tend to just be reskinned and retitled based off of whatever industry they happen to get applied to. Gerald might agree. I think one of the reasons why people are sometimes biased towards NIST is that they are sort of cut away from being industry specific. And so you'll always find that things like PCI or HIPAA or SOC will map back to NIST, but NIST in and of itself is just sort of a reference layer of controls. So it's very valuable to know it, but it's almost like learning Latin rather than any individual language that you would use in an industry. But I don't think there's going to be a universal framework, because when you move towards a universal framework, you end up with NIST controls. And as we all know, NIST controls by themselves are not all that useful unless they're put into context for somebody.
Oh, Gerald, do you have anything to say on that? No, knowing that you're such a NIST lover,
absolutely. So, I mean, for me personally, for anyone who's worked in GRC for more than like a minute, you'll have queried or Googled at some point, like, framework matrix or framework crosswalk or whatever. Like everybody's got like an Excel spreadsheet that has all the different frameworks and the overlays and mappings and stuff like that. So don't do the work of doing that yourself. Trust me, that's an artifact that's out there that a lot of people who work in the space try to find. As far as NIST goes, to take a step back and talk about these different frameworks, there is a heavy overlay of controls that appear in every single one of the frameworks, right? So like backups, right? Backups are going to be in everything. It doesn't matter if it's a framework that exists today or comes out in 3 years, it's going to be there. With the different frameworks, and the reason that I personally like NIST cybersecurity framework, to Jacob's point, he said it's not really practical to implement. I would argue that just saying NIST 853, which is the control catalog, like the entire taxonomy of what you could implement, isn't practical because there's no context for your organization. But using something like NIST cybersecurity framework, the whole differentiator really for me over something like ISO or SOC 2 is the way that it's laid out. Now, what that basically means is with SOC 2 and ISO and some of these other ones, they kind of break it up into almost like area, where with SOC 2, it's like security, privacy, and then confidentiality, integrity, availability. They're focused on the security objective of the data or the system. Whereas the NIST cybersecurity framework is, you can tell it's made by practitioners who understand how a living, breathing InfoSec program would actually work in a business. So there's basically left and right of boom. So there's protect and identify, everything you can do before something goes wrong. And then there's detect, respond, recover, everything you can do after to ensure resiliency and returning to a good known state. And for me, that's personally the key differentiator between the cybersecurity framework that NIST put out and many of the other ones, which I have implemented. So that's the key. And just the last thing I'll say before flipping it back to you, Jax, is to Jacob's point, FISMA compliance, which is what the federal government sought out, which is what NIST wrote all these controls for, and which eventually the framework came out of, and it all kind of maps back to the same corpus of controls. FISMA was very rigid and didn't really make sense. I worked in a Marine Corps setting for a while, and it made no sense to like apply these controls to like an antenna out in the middle of nowhere. But in order to get that compliance, you gotta do it. So that rigidity doesn't work, but in a practical setting, I feel that the NIST CSF does work.
That's a very Marine Corps thing to do, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, Gerald, I'm always surprised he wasn't in the military. Should have. Linda, for the sake of time, I'm going to pivot us into the next question, but really quick. I'm going to actually pose 2 questions. We've gotten some coming in. So in between these questions, I'm going to bring them up. Anybody can take this one. I'll let you guys choose. But here's the first question from Peter. Is there such thing as too much regulation from perspectives of business compared to security and privacy?
Linda, is that you?
No,
It can be anybody. I open the floor.
I think this question is anybody. I mean, sure, there's so much such a thing as too much regulation because there's such a thing as too much security. I mean, you put too much security in place and you can shut down the business. So surely, regulation follows in the same. So it's always about balance, right? And preferably it's a risk-based decision, and preferably it's a decision that the business leaders ultimately, we in security are there to serve the business, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's interesting on the question of too much regulation. I don't know if Erika has thoughts on this, but the history of PCI DSS is it is an industry standard. It is not a federal standard that was created, and it was actually developed by the payment card industry, by the credit card companies, specifically to avoid being regulated. So it's actually sort of a strange version in the landscape of all of these frameworks and stuff. What I would say in terms of too much regulation is, there's definitely too much regulation. But the strange thing about the GRC field is most industry verticals are not regulated in terms of cybersecurity. And I think the reason why anyone is listening to this panel at all is that we are all slowly realizing that that's changing. And so as a result, we're going to carry these frameworks forward. We're going to carry these controls forward. We're going to relabel them and recontextualize them. It's going to be nuts. It's going to probably get worse before it gets better in terms of different frameworks and standards. But yeah, there's definitely a limit to regulation. But I think for the last forever, we've been mostly playing in a space where there's essentially no cybersecurity regulation, with a few exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question, and then we're going to move on back to the agenda. I'll get back to your other question, Peter. So Roy posed a 2-part question. First part, as someone who's highly interested in the GRC and policy side of cyber InfoSec, if there's no one-size-fit-all type of strategy, is there a low-level starting point to start building knowledge? And then his part 2 of that was, so then would you say let your employer dictate what framework you end up specializing in?
So I can take this. I mean, starting point to build knowledge. I think you start familiarizing yourself with controls. I mean, what do controls mean? How do we test controls? How do we implement controls, right? How do we govern the maturity of these controls? I think that it all boils down to controls, because at the end of the day, whether it's regulation, whether it's framework, certifications, attestations, whatever, they all boil down to the commonality of we're dealing with some sort of controls. So I think from a starting perspective, audit 101, right? Start to learn security. How do we apply that in marrying the two?
Well, that great answer. Okay. All right, I'm going to move us on. So Linda, I'm going to have you kick this one off. This one is about GRC being at the forefront of conversation. We're hearing more and more about it, both in the public and the private sector. And I want to know what you think, what is causing this? And in your opinion, do you think that GRC will continue to see significant changes in this space, and why?
Well, yes, and yes. A theme that I'm probably going to hit on a few times in this time that we have together is I believe that when change is really imminent, what happens is we have influences coming both top down and bottom up. So what do I mean by that? In this space, the bottom up piece for GRC is that GRC is ultimately where the people and the procedure part comes into the security. A lot of controls, again, start with the technology and emphasize the technology, but we all know that a comprehensive system, and certainly a lot of the NIST 853, certainly 800-171 have a lot of non-technical components. So the risk management and the compliance pieces, there's a lot of not technical, and that's the bottom up part of the GRC. Top down though, and this is where we're also picking up a fair amount of momentum, is at the level of corporate leadership, the C-suite, and for public companies, the board of directors. If it's not a public company, it's the actual owner of the organization. The catchphrase first of all, governance is inherently their job. That's what the board of directors does. They have fiduciary responsibility and they oversee the governance of the company. So they have guidance, especially from the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the SEC is increasingly putting emphasis on, before we get to the level of cyber, there's a category that they call ESG, that stands for environmental, social, and governance, of which cybersecurity is a part. And the emphasis on ESG overall is really picking up steam, and the specifics around cyber is also picking up a lot of attention. And so when we get this top-down energy and the bottom-up, there's sure to be change.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk more on that change at the higher levels as we go through this discussion. Does anybody else want to add to this? Jacob, I know you were shaking your head.
Linda's absolutely right. And I think, the way to sort of think about this is there's sort of three domains where you can see this trend happening. One, like she said, is the SEC, so the actual regulation of publicly traded companies. And they are pushing more and more out of just the financial industry into all publicly traded companies, an increased emphasis on cybersecurity requirements as a responsibility of the corporate board in terms of their obligation as corporate directors. And as soon as you elevate cybersecurity to an obligation of a corporate director, it will immediately overnight be something that they take seriously. The security industry, we've flogged ourselves for years being like, how are we going to contextualize security in the language of the business? You know how you do that? The SEC tells them that this is now a business requirement, and suddenly it's going to get some time at the table. The other trend that you can see is in the insurance industry. So insurance has been cheap. It's just been the summer of love for getting cybersecurity policies, and everybody was having a great time. Turns out that's not a good idea. Premiums are going up. Some people are not even insurable anymore. I mean, we've seen crisis in Europe in the fallout over the years where act of war exclusions from insurance policies. This is something that Linda knows a lot about. You might not be able to get insurance, and insurance might be a business requirement. So now all of a sudden, cybersecurity is a requirement. And just like Linda was saying, the part that brings all these pieces together, the interface between the technology and security that we normally think about and all of that other business stuff, is this domain of GRC that sort of translates the two worlds between each other.
And when you were talking about acts of war, are you talking about Maersk? That's one example. Yeah, I'll send a link to a paper. Maybe you could put it in the show notes. But there's a lot of research right now. There's a lot of pending cases because insurance providers don't cover acts of war. And if they attribute cybersecurity issues to countries doing warlike things, then you might not actually get paid out on your gajillion-dollar insurance policy. Very awkward situation in the courts right now in terms of how that's going to play out. But that's fundamentally not a technology thing. This is sort of this weird in-between domain of the governance of how businesses run. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love that article, and I'll post it down below for anybody that wants to read that at the end of this show. Once we post it, I'll add that to the show notes. Now, speaking of breaches, and I want to ask you this question, Jacob, and it's kind of got a government lens because some of the oversight in the governance space is really laying heavy on organizations for really dictating what is a major breach, what does that look like, and then also a reporting requirement. We're seeing 72 hours getting thrown around. What are your thoughts around what is happening right now in the governance space around basically trying to reduce some of these breaches, but on top of that, starting to try to report them at an earlier time for the organization and having that 72-hour window? Well, I mean, nothing's going to get Congress's attention like shutting off the gas supply to the Eastern Seaboard and then telling everybody that no one picked up the phone to let them know that this was happening. I mean, if you look at some of the testimony in Congress and the subcommittees when they said, why didn't we know about this? Basically, the people testifying to Congress said, well, they weren't required to tell you. And this just blew Congress's mind because they're like, they supply all of the gasoline for the Eastern Seaboard effectively. They didn't
need to tell anybody when Colonial Pipeline happened. And so you started to see this sort of universal reporting requirement come up in debate. There's FISMA reform is something that Gerald mentioned earlier. There's all this legislation going through. What is the reporting requirement going to be for when you experience an incident? Do you have to tell anybody? And how soon do you have to tell somebody? What is the definition of an incident? Now, within federal contracting in the defense sector, where I primarily specialize in, this is old news. People have had a requirement to report incidents within 72 hours for years and years. It's actually one of the places where federal public sector security is way ahead of the curve from private sector security, because they've anticipated that this problem needed to exist. And you can sort of Google this and see there's been different forms of legislation. Is it 24 hours? Is it a week? Do we even need to tell anybody? They're still trying to hammer out what the requirements are, but we clearly have a problem because most industries don't have a reporting requirement. But we all know now that most industries are firmly in the sights of forces that we can't control. CISA, I mean, I'm sure everybody saw it. Their Shields Up notice that went out. The opening line in the Shields Up notice was, there's something happening on the other side of the planet, and every single business in the United States needs to be aware of what's going on. So something like a universal reporting requirement is an inevitability, like most other things in the GRC domain.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Gerald, Linda, Erika?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could chime in a little bit on it. I mean, it's a slippery path, right? When you start overreaching with government regulation on how private businesses should operate. And that's why NIST, for example, again, I'm going to get NIST on my knuckles here. That's why NIST has, really championed this public-private sector, relationship, and made the framework voluntarily based. But I agree, even if there was some, kind of not anonymous, but private reporting, or some type of required reporting, because I agree with Jacob, like in absence of knowledge, in absence of information, you can't take any action. There's no, imagine running a war, right? For the veterans here, running a war or whatever, and not having the different forward bases talking to each other or talking back to command. You have no clue what's going on at the macro level. So I definitely support something like that. It's a slippery slope, right? When you start doing that, but with the SEC requiring it, I think that is going to go a long way, because if you have to do it, you'll do it. But if you don't have to do it, what's the incentive? What's the motivation? People only do the things that they're motivated and incentivized to do. And if that doesn't exist, then they're not going to do it.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into what I want to touch on for the next question. Gerald, I'm going to punt this one over to you, because incentive, motivation, like getting individuals to get on board to do this. And Linda, you touched on this, like from the bottom up to the top down. And something that we hear way too often is compliance and cybersecurity are too costly. The cost outweighs the risk. So Gerald, what are some thoughts? What are your considerations on how do we convince leadership to invest in cybersecurity certifications instead of just risking the breach to happen or relying on cybersecurity insurance to protect us?
Yeah, well, Jesus, that's a big question. I'll try to boil it in like maybe 2-minute response. Really, in a 2022, in an effective information security officer or GRC person or whatever, like the business now knows, because ransomware is front page news, and we talk about cyber attacks and Colonial Pipeline and what Russia, Ukraine, right? So they're seeing it on USA Today. They're reading it on the Wall Street Journal. So the language is there. The insurance companies are going up with their premiums, and the CFO is now asking about it. So the conversation is there with the business side. The one thing that I think is really a paradigm shift that needs to be adopted at a wider scale is that you should not be seeking compliance. That is not the point. You should be implementing a cybersecurity program that can go from where you are today to some realistic maturity level that's acceptable for your organization across a time span that makes sense, because it takes time and money and resources, and you can't do everything all at once. There is no easy button. Like that needs to be in there. And then when a requirement comes up, because now all of a sudden, whatever, HIPAA comes out and, you need to attest. And I know I'm mixing things up and these all don't work, but I'm shooting from the hip, guys. Follow me on this one. So some external body requires you to certify some way. You should be able to just pull from your current control implementation setup and then turn around and provide it, right? You shouldn't be doing this like scramble where you're like, okay, well, what's the compliance standard say? All right, let's go implement those things. That is not the way to do information security. That's a recipe for disaster, frankly. And if you do that, like there's a saying in our industry, like maximum compliance is minimum security. Like that's not what you should be seeking. It should be a byproduct of your program as it is, that you're doing to attest to some external party that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. All right, let me drop a spicy.
Yes, we got a spicy in there. I was so happy. Linda, I know that you've got something probably to say on this topic. This is your area of expertise, is like understanding how do we get the leaders on board when there is a cost to this.
Well, exactly. So I completely 100% agree with Gerald, that we should be able to just do security because it's the right security solution at the right level. And then when we're asked for compliance, it's a simple matter, except that that's not the reality. And we've had plenty of time to notice that that's not the reality. And so, what's wrong with this picture, right? How's that working out for us? It's not. There's a saying among many that said that there are two kinds of security. Before the incident, there's too much security. And then once the incident occurs, there's not enough security. So how do we talk to the business about this? Well, one of the things that's been one of the patterns that's been noticed is that spending in cybersecurity is definitely more dominantly, much more dominantly on incident remediation and recovery. That there's relatively little investment in protection and preparation. So there is a business mentality, which is to not overspend, to manage your expenses, and so inherently in other areas as well, there's a tendency to not spend until it becomes a matter of survival, until it becomes mission critical. This happened to us in quality, by the way, in the 80s. If any of you, in your case, you may not recall, but you may have read your history, that quality was not a hot topic for American manufacturers until the Japanese came in and ate our lunch. And then we picked up on that theme, and quality became more of a factor that we built in. I see that's very much the mindset change that is ultimately going to have to happen here in cybersecurity. I see that what's incumbent upon us as security professionals and as GRC professionals is that, it's a very hot topic for us to have role-specific education and awareness. I see that for senior leaders, some of the business information we have, and we've already talked about the SEC, we've already talked about some of the regulations that are coming in. We've talked about insurance, but some of the other factors are things like mergers and acquisitions, the impact that cybersecurity has on their credit ratings, and in fact on intangible assets that make up their stock price value as opposed to the tangible assets, and how that's all shifted over time. What turns out, a lot of our leaders have a 1985 mindset around tangible and intangible assets. I have a fabulous graph that says how that's changed, and to help leaders, move forward into the world in which they're really conducting business. But it's incumbent on us as professionals in this area to educate them on some of the facts that we understand that they may not yet have. So a lot of us don't want to become teachers because we're afraid of being preachers.
Yeah, or criticized, and that's just going to happen anyway. And that was a great answer. Thank you, Linda. And I want to take a step back on something that Gerald said, and I'm going to send this over to you, Erika, to dive just a little bit deeper into it. But, and we hear this all the time in this space, we should not be seeking compliance. Gerald said while he was talking about this. And I want to ask you, Erika, we hear that compliance is not security all the time. And my question is, so why do people think, and people being, those leaders, those executive leaders, why do they think that compliance is security? And then why are they just seeking compliance?
Yeah, so this is definitely a hot topic. So compliance is something, like Gerald mentioned, it should come naturally. So if you're doing the right things, let's just say you're setting up an environment, you should be utilizing security best practices. Why not utilize, and we hear this, security by design, privacy by design. If you do things the right way from the beginning, later down the road, when a client or a prospect comes to you and says, hey guys, let's talk about this, I'm going to need a report on compliance against this framework or whatever, it's going to be a lot easier for your organization to get with the program and get that audit going and underway and provide the assurances that are needed. Because guess what? You've done this stuff all along. You can prove that you segmented the network appropriately, that you have encryption done the right way. You're not scrambling towards the end to try to do it reverse. You're not trying to find compliance, right? You're already compliant because you've done security by design from the very beginning. And I think something important to highlight here is like the costs of not doing this are humongous. So while it may be a cost spend, think of it as an investment. If you're doing this the right way from the beginning, your resources are a lot more valuably spent than if you're backtracking, trying to re-engineer, reconfigure things to try to fit them into a box to then be able to check the box. And Jacob, I see you going off mute, so I'd love for you to add.
Get your spicy button ready. This is my favorite. This is my favorite topic, and we don't have enough time to go into it, so I apologize ahead of time. But that's how it works when you try to fit GRC into just an hour. So this is the most interesting idea to me: is this debate around compliance is not security, and we're gonna get a little crazy here. So just stick with me. Have you ever met somebody who associated their body weight with their fitness level? Like, if you ever met somebody that wasn't overweight, but they weren't all that healthy, right? It's a pretty common thing. What's happening is they are using a number, their body weight, as a surrogate for their overall health. And this is a very common thing that all humans do for almost everything. We surrogate the metric of what we want, and we use that metric as the thing that we're going after. This happens in companies a lot, where they try to get customer satisfaction surveys. What ends up happening over time is the number of surveys that they get becomes more important than what the surveys are supposed to represent. What happens with compliance is that companies will use control frameworks or minimum standards as surrogate for security. They're using their body weight as a surrogate for their health. The bizarre thing to me is that we then turn around and blame the controls as if it's their fault, right? This is a very common psychological problem. Now, what that means is that the GRC field has a lot of room for disruption, because if we know that humans are always going to do this weird thing, then we're going to just have to make sure that the requirements are written better. Because if companies, like Linda said, are just going to end up going to the bare minimum, despite, having Gerald on staff and telling them that's not what they're supposed to do, there's this idealistic version of what they should do. The solution is not to shame them or to hope for some miraculous change. It's to make the minimum standards better, which implies that we're going to have to keep riffing on these control frameworks and these different versions over time. So it's a false dichotomy to say that security and compliance are not the same thing. Of course, they're not the same thing. The problem is that people are associating it, and that's not compliance's fault.
Can I have a thought I need to chime in on here, which is I'm not so sure that it's the controls that we need to have be better. I think ultimately it's the governance. Because I'm not sure that writing the controls is going to be able to happen fast enough. Governance can be far more dynamic, but we need better informed decision makers, right? So that's my 2 cents.
You got to bring us back, Jax. You brought up compliance versus security, and now everybody's freaking out.
Gerald, where's the spicy button?
I know, Gerald, spicy.
I did hit it, but I think Linda said something. There we go. Yeah.
Are you not hearing it? Yeah, you got it.
Okay, good stuff.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add, Linda, what you just said that marries up with Jacob is that this is a cultural thing. This is a cultural shift that has to happen within the organization.
Yeah,
I will let you take it back.
I call it cultural armor.
Yes.
Well, and we all know that, changing the culture of an organization is like super easy, right? What's the big deal?
Oh, it's trivial.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that is the skill set. I mean, when I started to see the problems in other, non-cybersecurity, just other technology projects, and I saw where the hard spots were, where the breakdowns was that we were forcing the business to change, and nobody had their eye on that ball. I mean, that's exactly what's happening in cybersecurity so often. Is we're trying to shove these controls in place. And it does change the business. Some of it can be under the hood. They don't have to know that there's an antivirus running. They just have to know they have one and that it's active. But other things, we need their participation. We need their engagement. And certainly from senior leaders, we need their support. Without that it's been called air cover. Without that air cover from senior leadership, nothing's going to happen at the grassroots.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, 100%. And before we segue into that question on leadership, which I'm going to have you spearhead that one, Linda, I want to scroll back up really quick. Peter, he actually submitted a question fairly early on, and I've been holding out on it. So thanks for your patience, Peter. So what are the processes for when companies fail to meet X requirements? Are there general post-assessment buffers between different industries? Who would like to take that one?
So I'm happy to take this from a deficiency perspective. So if as an organization you meet a control, let's say last year, this year you have an audit and you no longer have the assurance, let's just say vulnerability scan came back, you failed to patch what you needed to patch appropriately, or maybe you didn't perform the vulnerability scans in the quarter at all. There are implications there, and it differs from depending on what framework you're being assessed against or what your contractual obligations are. So I think the repercussions are different. It could be a deficiency that is visible on a report, or it could be that there are other postmortem activities that need to happen. But then internally within the organization, I mean, the idea is that you go back to the drawing board, you identify that risk area, that there's some kind of plan for it, and that the control owners are then given, a timeline and what needs to happen from a remediation perspective to mitigate the risk of that control failing again.
I just want to jump in with a quick example. So that, one of the reasons why the boring world of defense acquisitions is getting all this attention is because they started to turn the screws on what happens if you don't have these controls implemented. And effectively, the government came out and said, if you don't implement these controls, you no longer get to work with government contracts. And for businesses where that is 100% of their revenue or any significant percent of their revenue at all, it immediately got everyone's attention. Now, they're still hammering out how that's going to work out, but it just is an example of saying, if they turn around and they say you have deficiencies and deficiencies are not acceptable, immediately GRC and security become the number one priority for these companies. So dialing it back a little bit is probably the solution, but it does get people's attention.
And I got to jump in here. It's part of why the example that both Erika and Jacob mentioned earlier of PCI DSS, that is among all of the frameworks we threw out here today. It's quite unique in as much as it's not a regulation. It has no affiliation directly with the government. It's an industry self-enforced thing. But here's the thing, that baby has teeth, because if you do not match the requirements for that framework, what happens is you cannot take money. You cannot process credit card payments, and that's kind of a motivator that gets attention. And it's unique because it does have that mechanism, and very few other frameworks have anywhere close to that kind of enforcement.
Love that. I love these answers. This is awesome. I love as we go along, we're becoming more and more engaged. And one more question, and then we're going to go back into the agenda. I'm going to punt this one over to you, Gerald, because you've been quiet and we need some more spicy buttons out there, or any of the sound effects that you have, the myriad of sound effects. But Kerry posed a really good question. He's talking about it, trying to get back into networking skills. Is there anything he should do or any skills that he should have within the GRC space?
Yeah, so in this context, I'm assuming he's talking about technical networking. So I'll answer it from that perspective. typically GRC with the level of technical touch that would be involved in there, you're not going to be getting into like router configurations and understanding the difference between like RIP and, OSPF or what, like, you're not going to be doing all that. It's much more. So if I was going to advise someone to do this, definitely understand principally how a TCP IP stack works, that OSI network layer. So look into that, understand the 7 layers specifically around transport and network layer, because when we talk as auditors or when we're assessing actual risk as risk analysts, like, vendor wants to come in and hook their network up to ours. What is the risk of that? Then you got to understand what network flows look like. Are we going to be using access control lists, the way that they kind of segment where data can pass through firewalls and stuff like that? That's kind of the contextual level that you need to know. It's below plugging in a router, but it's above, network engineer layer stuff. Also, I would suggest, I've been in this game, like many of you, like for a very long time. And I don't know if it's just because of personal preference I shy away, but like cryptography for me is basically what is the current acceptable encryption standard. AES 256, let's go. Like, I don't need to know what's going on underneath that, but you should be familiar with what encryption standards there are, because when the data is transitioning across the wire, it needs to be encrypted, and you need to understand what that encryption is. Or if you're going to build a VPN tunnel, what is, is it an IPsec tunnel? Like, what is the encryption going on the network? And for me, those are really, I guess, the 3 areas that I would focus on if I was new in trying to understand. Definitely that OSI stack is foundational, regardless of what you do in cybersecurity. And then understanding kind of what network flows is kind of the other thing, with encryption is the third.
I think just to jump on to what you're saying, Gerald, so you can see this happening, especially in the privacy space, which is, under this umbrella of GRC. I mean, one of the hottest areas in terms of salary growth and just need for people is in privacy engineering, which is actually merging technical chops with privacy requirements. I mean, the reason that entire domain exists is literally because of privacy regulation, and it sits at that intersection. So if people are interested, I don't know if you've talked about that on your podcast before, Gerald, but it's definitely something to Google and to kind of pull the onion back on, because privacy engineering is, I think, where a lot of security is heading, is that blend of technical skill and GRC know-how and merging the two together.
Yeah, absolutely. So May 13th on Simply Cyber, Jacob Horne will be speaking about privacy engineering. So
I love that. Yes, make that happen. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes, and I'm going to do one more question. I want to apologize for any of the questions I didn't get to in the chat. I did see some of them get answered by our community members, so thank you for that. But I want us to wrap up and talk about champions. And Linda, I'm going to bunt this over to you. So champions in the GRC space. As Linda and many of the panelists have talked about, we need support and we need buy-in from the lower level and also the higher level, but even more so the stakeholders, the higher level, because even if you've got buy-in at the lower level and the key leaders don't have the influence or they're not supporting the change, it's not going to happen. It's like Erika said about a cultural shift. So Linda, how do we create champions in the C-suite to support us as professionals to sell GRC to the organization and get on board?
Right. Yeah. So, has anybody ever tried to sell you something that you didn't think you needed?
Yeah.
It doesn't work, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to say no and kind of walk away. So the extent to which our senior leaders, and again, C-suite, board, the owner of the company, it always depends on the exact circumstances and the context. What business are they in? What does have their attention? But sharing information with them as professionals, it's role specific education and awareness for them when we make them aware of some of the pressures that are really there, because we've got reinforcements coming to help us. We've got the SEC, we've got the insurance company, we've got information from mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of places from which I draw the data to make the business case to share information with these really important stakeholders, so that they get to the point where they develop a little bit more appetite. Oh, you mean if I want to go sell my company, the valuation of that company is going to be affected by certain things in certain ways. And cyber can factor very heavily in those kinds of, that's just one example. Now that's the content. I have started to identify that making the business case, most people fixate on the content because I can show them a few slides and they're like, oh, that's really good. And it is, it's really good, but it's not the whole thing. As when we come to these conversations frequently from a background, most of us here have technical backgrounds, right? I did, I'm an engineer. I had to learn this stuff on the job. So there's the content of the conversation, which is that kind of information like I just rattled off. But there's also who do we need to have the conversation with and what matters to them. That's real good old-fashioned stakeholder management right out of PMP training for those of you that have that. I use a stakeholder map. I think through who are the stakeholders, what really matters to them, what are their charters, who's leaning on them. Because a lot of us think the CEO makes the rules. I'll tell you a secret. He doesn't. She doesn't. Typically, the CEO has most of their marching orders from the board. And the board doesn't sit around making up big visions. The board has fiduciary responsibilities, and a lot of what they do is a check the box exercise. So, isn't it interesting that a lot of our exercises end up being check the box exercises? That tone is being set way up at the top. So there's the who do we need to talk to? That's the stakeholders. There's the content. We've already talked about that. The third piece is how do we have these conversations? How do we structure them? How do we ask for the meetings? How do we conduct ourselves in the meetings in a way to interact? And that's a combination of sales skills and some strategy. And frankly, some of the stuff I've studied is executive coaching. And some of the frameworks that I use in that area come from my executive coaching training. So it's 3 areas, and I'm starting to share the information with other colleagues because I'm seeing this is what we collectively as a profession need in order to get the message through to the C-suite.
100%. Yep. And you said it, know your audience. I like how you were talking about know what you're selling, know who you're selling it to. I know we're at time and I want to respect everybody's time on this panel. So I want to open up the floor for final thoughts, either on the last question or just final thoughts before we close this out.
Well, I know we're running out here. So I think my first thought is we're going to have to do a follow-up because there's too much to talk about in just 1 hour. And my second thought is just a question that I would leave with everybody is if NIST were, if the NIST, frameworks were a Harry Potter house, which one would they be and why is it Gryffindor?
God, Jacob, I love it. That's wonderful. Okay, nothing else. Then I'm going to take you all off the stage. Gerald, do you want off mute? Do you need it? You want to say anything?
Well, I was prepared with a final.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I mean, just there's one critical part of GRC that we didn't talk about today that I have personally utilized as a weapon, if you will. And maybe if we meet again, that can be the launch point for the next discussion. But security awareness is a piece of GRC's world. And a lot of times people think that that's just like an annual PowerPoint. The way that I implement security awareness is much more just in time. So that QR code, the Coinbase Super Bowl ad, what an awesome opportunity to send a message on Monday to my my end user community and say, hey guys, I know that was a cool commercial and all, but you know what? It could go to a malicious website just as easily. So be careful when you're using QR codes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's a point in time. But the thing is, you start instilling these ideas of, security. Like they don't think security awareness. They just become aware. And then they start changing behaviors because it protects them personally. So then when you have that conversation about, guys, if this Russian-Ukraine thing spills over because there's a new wiper that's going on, kind of similar to NotPetya, if it spills into our organization, we are not protected. We don't have immutable storage. They're not going to know what that means exactly, but you've tuned them up to be ready to have a conversation and think that way. So it's just, we didn't talk about it, but I think it's a very valuable tool in the toolbox of the GRC CISO group.
100%.
Thank you.
Love that. I think that's an awesome point, Jerry. And I think next time we also dive deeper into risk management, because I think, Linda, to your point on how do we brief executives, how do we get more buy-in into these programs? I think risk management is a huge component of that. Knowing our audience, presenting the risks that they care about, and the things that are going to cost more money if we don't invest on the front end.
I love this. You guys are great. All right. So what I've heard, though, is we're going to do a round 2 in a few months. So everybody stay tuned for that. Linda, Jacob, Gerald, Erika, this wouldn't have been possible without you all. Thank you so much for being the guest on Outpost Gray.
Thanks, everybody.
Taking you all off stage now. Bye. Okay. So, wow, that was awesome. I'm fired up. I don't know if you're fired up. That is awesome. So really quick, let's do some end of notes, show notes for you all. So next week, don't forget, we're going to be going off schedule next week. Instead of hosting our live stream from 3 to 4 p.m. EST, we're going to be going live from 9 to 10 a.m., where I'll be sitting down with Simon Lindstedt, and we're going to be talking about InfoSec Live, but even more so talking about how he created a cybersecurity community from scratch. And it's always a good time when Simon and I are on a live stream. Also to add, next week on Friday is the Cyber Career Day, InfoSec Live Cybersecurity Career Day. It's a 5-hour live stream. Make sure, go to the YouTube, like and subscribe. Also, if you're watching this, I would highly encourage you to raid Simply Cyber shortly after this at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. So in about 25 minutes, Gerald is actually going to be interviewing a guest, and they're going to be talking about branding and how branding will help you get a job. So I'm actually really excited about this, because I can tell you from experience, because of my brand and what I've been doing, I created my dream job. So that announcement will be out probably in the next couple of weeks. So really excited about that. And then finally, if you've been watching this and you enjoyed this, I would encourage you, go ahead and hit subscribe and go ahead and like it. And then share this episode with others. That would mean the world to me. And huge thanks to my community. This wouldn't be possible without any of you guys. You guys make this possible and make me want to come back every Thursday to provide you more information. All right. I am Jax signing out. You guys have a good one. Bye.